Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting edition of How Do I Do This Anyways? Today, we're going to be talking about geometric constraints and fully constrained versus not fully constrained, and how you can use geometric constraints to change an object around and how to make sure you can scale it, like make it larger, but keep the same relationships between the lines, like making sure lines are parallel to one another, perpendicular to one another, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and get started and delve into this. You're going to be basically making this part with me, but the key is the whole doing it thing. So we're going to build it. We're going to play with the sketch a lot, and we're going to make sure that we understand it. So let's go ahead and create a new part. And this is going to be in metric. So standard MMIPT. Double click that to create it. Oh, by the way, we are in activity. Where'd it go? There it is. We are in activity 133. Yep, constraining a sketch. We're going to be starting off with number 16. Okay, so let's go. We're going to start a 2D sketch, and I'm just going to go ahead and click that YZ plane. Now, since we're going to be using vertical and horizontal constraints, we want to make sure that the view cube is sitting right there in the front. Okay, now in PLTW, it gives us these nice steps that we're supposed to follow in order to make the lines. I'm going to go ahead and follow those, and we start out with a nice horizontal line. I'm going to come up here, zoom out a scotch, grab my line tool, and I'm just going to click and drag it over this way, okay? It doesn't matter how long the line is, and I'm going to hit escape to drop the line tool. I'm not putting it over here next to either of my axes, and definitely not next to the origin, because I'm going to constrain it over to those things later. And I'm just going to grab my line tool, and I'm going to follow the instructions that it's telling me to here. So what we want to do is we want to start on this left side, and we want to go perpendicular up from that, and then we're going to go horizontally over, and then we're going to go at a crazy angle up to the side. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make sure that I get my green dot here. That way it's placing a coincidence constraint on the end of that line. And the way that that little symbol there snaps in place, that's a vertical constraint on there. You see how it's at a 90-degree angle? That indicates that it is a perpendicular constraint. And now you see this other little symbol that's there, where it's got the red line and the black line going into it? That's a perpendicular constraint line or symbol. So now I've got my three lines going at crazy angles. Now, going back to my further instructions. Now I just go vertical, but I want this line 5, to be perpendicular to this line. Okay, so the way I'm going to make this line, I'm not going to allow it to make its own constraint. I'm going to drag it up here at this weird angle. I'm going to drop my line tool again, and I'm going to make a perpendicular constraint here, there to there. Now that's aligned perpendicular. It has to be perpendicular. So going back to our instructions, now I'm going to put that on, and I'm going to continue on around the whole thing. So let's go ahead and get started on that. My line tool, I'm making sure that I put my coincidence constraint, and I'm just going to go off at a weird angle. And then I'm going to go off at a weird angle again. I'm being careful not to allow it to make any of these horizontal lines here. I don't want it to build any constraints on its own. I just want to be able to make the constraints as I see them later. Okay, so that's my thing. Looks kind of like a boat. Yours doesn't have to look exactly like that, but somewhere in this ballpark. And you should definitely only have your 10 line segments here as described here. Okay. Now that we've got that, we're going to do part G, where this is where it's actually starting to have us build the constraints. So the first one is we want line 7 parallel with line 5. Well, easy enough. We got this convenient constraint called parallel right here. So we're going to click that and say 7, 5, stay parallel. Now, going back, line 8 perpendicular to 4. So line 8 is here, line 4 is there, and we want those to always be perpendicular. So I'm going to grab my perpendicular constraint. I'm going to grab line 8, click line 4, and now that little symbol pops up saying that they are always perpendicular. Next, line 9 and line 3 should always be parallel. Okay, cool. There's my parallel constraint. Line 9, line 3. Wow. Now, yours might look a little bit different than that. I'm going to go ahead and drag this up a little because otherwise I'm going to get lost in this geometry and it's going to make less and less sense as we go up. So I just want to try and keep that-ish shape, this shape here-ish, okay? As long as you can see that shape easily, you can click and drag to make it happen into that shape. It'll be easier to do. But line 9, line 3 are now parallel. Let's see. Connect endpoints of line 1 and line 9. That's what line 10 is. We already did that with the coincidence constraints. If you didn't make coincidence constraints there, you need to do that. Next up. All right, so drag the lines around to see what happens. Okay, so this is where you actually want to just play with this and kind of record, observe what happens to all of the pieces. Okay, how can you move them? What happens when you try to move them? Okay, take a look, make some observations, record them, maybe take a few screenshots to help you explain the answer to this question. Next up, line 2 and 10 should always be parallel. Great. So I'm going to grab my parallel tool. I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to grab that, and now it looks like that. Yours probably looks a little bit different. But again, I'm just going to drag my lines back to where they are ish in the right orientation to ish look like this shape. Okay? So line 2 and 10 should be parallel. Got it. Line 6 should be parallel with the x-axis. Okay. So I know my x-axis is always horizontal. That's why I made a big deal about making sure your view cube was in the right orientation. If your view cube looks like this, then this is going to have to be a vertical line. But if it looks like this, like I told you it should, then what you can do is just go ahead and grab your horizontal constraint tool and put a horizontal constraint on that thing. Okay? So now that line is always horizontal. You can move it wherever you feel like. It's going to stay flat. Now, let's see here. Line 5 and 7 should always be the same length. Let's see here. 5 and 7. That would be this line and this line. So I'm going to come up here to my equal. No. Equal. There it is. Click that and click that. And now magically, those two are the same. Okay. Next up. Line 3 and 9 are aligned horizontally, so they move up and down together. Okay, so this one is 3 and this one is 9. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make them collinear. Okay, so collinear means that if that one is always lined up with that one, period. It's just a continuation of the line. All right, so now I can drag these and they both move together, which is pretty neat. All right, now add geometric constraint to CAD to enforce each restriction that is not satisfied. So basically, we're supposed to look at this thing and make sure that everything is correct and everything is the same. Now, there's a couple of things I'm going to tell you to add. For one, you should have an equal constraint between this side and this side. Okay, now they're equal. That's nice. And also, we need to go ahead and place another line through here. This is actually, in the next part, we want to make a vertical line and a bisector of the whole thing. So what we're going to do Actually, I'm going to undo, or I'm going to delete the constraint that I just made of these equal constraints. Delete that, because I want this to be able to move around to show you the difference between things. So I'm going to grab my line tool and we're going to make a bisecting line on this thing. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over here to my first line and I'm going to wait till it flashes green. And that green spot is the midpoint. It makes a coincidence constraint on the midpoint. I'm going to do the same thing on the top. And I'm just going to click that line and drag or drop it there. Now I'm going to hit escape a couple of times to drop my line tool. Now what I need to do is I need to place a vertical constraint. I always want that line to be vertical, okay? So now that I've got that vertical, let's see, that's my symmetry and my construction line. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now I need to make sure that my sides are always going to be symmetric, okay? So that's what's happening. That's what we need to do next. So that is where I want to go ahead and place my equal constraints here and here. Okay. And now this looks a whole lot like a mirror image from left to right. Okay. But it is still not fully constrained, although it's geometrically constrained. I can go and I can adjust all of these different sides and play with it a lot, but it is not fully constrained. So let's see here. I already did that. Now we need to add this circle here. Okay, we want to put the circle so that way the center of it is directly below that intersect point, and also it is tangent to a horizontal midpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. First, I'm going to drop my circle. I'm just going to place it off to the side somewhere over here. I'm being careful that I don't accidentally create some sort of another constraint on there. So all those little dotted lines that keep popping up, those are optional constraints that it's trying to guess that I want to place. So I just placed that, and it's a construction line. I'm going to right click that and turn it off of construction. Come on. Uncheck that. It's not going to let me. So I'm just going to delete that now. Turn my construction line off, reselect center or circle, and put it on there. Since it's a solid line, it is not a construction line. I do need a construction line though for over here. So I'm going to make my line a construction line. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to find that midpoint again. When it flashes green, that's the midpoint. And I'm just going to drag this over some. Maybe I'll just go ahead and lock it to that other midpoint. Now I'm going to drop that line tool and I'm going to make my constraints in order to place the circle in the right spot. So the first constraint I want is a vertical constraint where the center is lined up with that point. Cool, groovy, I love it. Now I want a tangent constraint between that circle and that line. That's great. Now, what this oftentimes will do is just create an enormous circle, because technically this circle still satisfies both of those constraints. So if it did that, if you made an enormous circle, just drag it a little bit smaller. It'll clean up here in a moment when we actually add some dimensions to it. Just make sure it's ish looking like that. Now, next, we got to mirror it across that center line that we just created. So we're going to make an identical hole over here, circle. It'll be a hole later. So I'm going to come up to my mirror tool from my pattern tools, and I want to click and drag to select the geometry. Now I'm going to click this box to select my mirror line, and I'm going to select the mirror line. And unfortunately, there's no preview, so I just have to have a leap of faith and click apply. And now it's going to be there. Click done. Now I'm done with that mirror tool. Now, what PLTW is asking you to do, or the next thing you're supposed to do, is experiment with it. Okay, so this is going to be fun. You're just going to take this thing and play with it. You can do all kinds of stuff to break this thing, or you can try to, But all of the constraints that are here have to be satisfied geometrically, okay? Sometimes it's difficult to not grab the constraints and actually grab the lines. But play around with this, see what happens when you're dragging points. Like before, you could drag this point on off and mess with the line directions. Now we can't. And plus, it makes sure it drags the other side with it, okay? So play with that a little bit, make some observations. The next part we're supposed to do now is where you are supposed to understand what the difference is between a fully constrained and a geometrically constrained object. Figure that out. Now we want to add some dimensions to it. So these are the dimensions we want to add. Generally, when you're throwing dimensions onto something after it's been geometrically constrained, you want to start with the largest dimensions and then move to the smallest ones. Work X direction and then work Y direction. At least that's what I found to be easy. It works in a lot of different ways. Now, what's probably going to end up happening is when you go typing up some numbers, it's going to mess the shape up. If it messes the shape up terribly, then what you're going to have to do is actually like just click and drag parts so that way they are fixed. Failed to edit dimension. Cool. So this would be one of those times where we actually have to stop and think about it. Wow. Okay, so that has to be 45. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Delete that dimension. Okay, and now what I want to do is I just want to drag this side down. Okay, and what might actually help me is to go ahead and dimension the circles first because they're going crazy. 5. And now I might be able to just dimension this. Boom. And one last thing, I forgot to do this earlier. I want to go ahead and put a coincidence constraint between that center point that's on the bottom and our origin. So that way the thing is fully constrained to the origin. And now, drop all my tools by hitting escape. I can click and drag on any of these sides I want. And nothing is moving. Nothing is changing sizes, shapes, nothing. This is what it means, or this is an example of a fully constrained object. So that's how you draft this thing. That's how you put all the constraints on, the geometric constraints as well as the dimensional constraints. So you should be able to figure out the rest of these questions and how to edit this thing. Play with it. So if you have any more questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have fun.